All right, guys, welcome to Mr. Lee's history class. As you know, Mr. Lee's on vacation right now, but that doesn't mean that the learning stops. All right, the show must go on, as they say, so you guys still get to listen to the lovely sound of Mr. Lee's voice as you see some notes on World War II today. All right, so as we go through this, I highly recommend you guys writing these notes down so that way you can have them to refer to in future events in case of maybe a test that might be coming up sooner rather than later. Okay. So make sure you guys are saving this stuff, getting it down. Okay. Might even not hurt to download the video, maybe listen to it as you sleep. So that way you just fall asleep to the sound of Mr. Lee in your head. You can just hear it all the time because that's what everybody needs in their lives, right? More Mr. Lee. Okay. So we're talking about World War II, one of Mr. Lee's favorite topics today. So we're going to do a little bit about the background lead up to it, and how things got started and how the U.S. enters into it today. And then tomorrow, you guys are going to learn a little bit more about the specific battles and end of the war. In the first slide we have here, so some just generally speaking, some causes. Whoops, let me go back. Some causes of World War II. Okay, so one of the biggest things that, and one of the most important reasons that we talk about World War I is because of how it almost certainly results in World War II. So if you remember, at the end of World War I, we had the Treaty of Versailles, this massive treaty that was very, very unfair to the Axis powers that lost, in particular Germany. Okay, so we talked about the high war debts that Germany had out of the war. And then remember, we also talked about the worldwide depression that's going on. We talked about the Great Depression that was occurring in the United States at the time, but it also was going on in Europe. Okay, so Germany is getting hit very, very hard. And then you also have some political shifts going on in Germany. In 1920, the German Workers' Party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party. Okay, so the Nazi Party gets its start in 1920, the year after the Treaty of Versailles is signed. Okay, so it starts to grow as a very small movement, a third-party movement, if you will, and then it gets thousands and thousands of people. As the 1920s go on, it gets more and more people to join them. And then in 1929, the Nazis put forward a German referendum where the German people vote on whether or not to accept the Treaty of Versailles or to recognize it, because the German government already accepted the treaty. The German people, pushed by the Nazis, denied that the Treaty of Versailles should be accepted by the German government and kind of pushed on it. And so then in the the early 1930s, in September, the Nazis were the second largest political party in Germany. Okay, so part of the reason that they get such recognition by the Germans and they get so many people to join their cause so quickly is because of the economic struggles of the Great Depression, in combination with the economic struggles that Germany was experiencing because of the Treaty of Versailles and the high war debt that they had to pay back to the other allies, Britain, France, and the United States. Okay, so Hitler, as he becomes kind of the leader of the Nazi Party, he blames most of the economic problems on the government of Germany, which was called the Weimar Republic, and then also the Jewish people. Okay, statistically, in Germany, the large number of national banks were owned by Jewish, not necessarily all of them, obviously, but a decent amount of them were owned. But that doesn't mean that they were to blame for this. This is one of those things that kind of just happened, but that's who Hitler decides to place the blame on. Okay, so Hitler comes out with his economic plans, and he says that we should solve the unemployment problem by gradually increasing the military power in Germany. Sounds like a great idea. However, if you guys remember from the Treaty of Versailles, that Germany is not supposed to have this large military, but Hitler decides to ignore the Treaty of Versailles, start building up the military anyways. This gets more Germans employed, starts helping out their economy a little bit more. They're making more tanks, more guns, more bullets, all this kind of stuff to help build up their factories a little bit. And the European leaders see this, and they're they're kind of looking over their shoulder at Hitler, but they're like, okay, we don't want to poke him too much. We don't want to, we're going to let Germany be. Despite the fact that, we know that he's not supposed to be doing this, we're going to let it go. We're just going to let him skate by for right now. Okay? So that's kind of the lead up in the German side of things. Generally speaking, all throughout Europe, there's a rise of fascist governments. Okay? So this took place in Italy with Benito Mussolini, which we'll talk about him in a minute. This took place in Germany, obviously, with Adolf Hitler. This took place a little bit in Spain with Francisco Franco. He was more of a communist, but he also had some fascist tendencies. This took place in Japan with Hideki Toho, the new Japanese military commander who basically ruled. He was the second in command under the Japanese emperor. So these fascist governments started to come up, and they were popular because of that militaristic, nationalistic tendencies. Remember, we talked about some of the causes of World War I were militarism and nationalism. Those causes, those problems are still underlying in European culture. You still see those existing very, very much. So because of World War I, because that happened, some countries really did not make out too well, and not necessarily in terms of how the treaty at the end treated them, like Germany got screwed in that, but other countries, some smaller countries, Italy, France, England, they said, okay, we realize that maybe war is a possibility, so we really need to build up our military, okay? We need to get our military geared just in case this happens again. And so the most effective way to have a military and to build up a military is to spend a lot of money on it, okay? Sounds great. However, if you are a relatively small country, it's hard to take a large amount of your money and put that towards the military because you need it for other things, okay? So as these fascist leaders come into power, they promise the citizens that they can get more military power, more military might, which leads into the citizens' nationalistic and militaristic passions. He kind of taps those things, these leaders, and then they are okay with putting him in power. And then as more and more freedom start taking away, the leader is spinning it in a way that is making it seem that it's okay because it's giving them better security, more military power, so the citizens accept that. All right, so let's talk about some of these fascist dictators, these military commanders that were coming up. All right, obviously, the most infamous one is Adolf Hitler from Germany. Obviously, Hitler is one of the perpetrators of the biggest crimes in world history, but you do have to recognize that he was an excellent speaker. Okay, he's very, very good speakers. He was a very, very key in getting the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. He knew how to speak to people. He knew how to inflame their passions. He knew how to recognize what the people wanted, exploit those weaknesses. Right. So he gets elected to be the leader of the Nazi Party in July of 1921, and then in 2 years later, or a little bit less than 2 years later, in May of 1923, he tries to overthrow the German government. Okay, so he wasn't successful the first time, obviously. It's known as the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich, and he's sentenced to prison for treason. Okay, however, because he was such a popular leader with the people within the Nazi Party, his sentence is overturned in 1924. So a little bit more than a year after he's put in prison, his sentence is overturned. While he was in prison, though, for committing treason against the German government, trying to overthrow it, he really kind of formalized a lot of his ideas that he was going to use to lead the Nazi Party and to push Germany into World War II. And he wrote a book called Mein Kampf. All right, translated, that means My Struggle. That's when he kind of outlines his plans for the German military, his plans for the German government, what he thinks is wrong with the current German government, about how he's blaming the Jews for the problem, what Germany needs to do to quote unquote restore its former glory. All right. So he gets released from prison in December of 1924, and he starts gaining political power again, rises back up in the Nazi Party, and then in January of 1933, the Nazi Party wins control of the German Reichstag, which is the German legislative branch, basically their version of Congress. Okay, And the way that the German government at the time worked is whatever party won the majority in the Reichstag, in their Congress, they get to put up their leader as chancellor. So obviously their leader is Adolf Hitler, so they put him up as chancellor. And so in January of 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party has control of the Reichstag, or the German Congress, and so they get to pass laws that Hitler wants, the Nazi Party agrees with, because they control both branches, and they start to suspend civil liberties for Germans. They start taking away freedoms of the German. Okay, so shortly after that, he gets granted emergency powers, and then by the winter of 1934 into the spring of 1935, he has complete dictatorial control over Germany. Okay, and this is where you start to see some of the more atrocious things come out of Germany in terms of the treatment of the Jewish people, and not only the Jewish people, but in terms of how he treats people who, with disabilities, mental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, minorities of all types, not just Jews, but ethnic Poles, ethnic Slavs, Black people, basically anyone who was not someone who fitted his idea of what the quote unquote good Germans were. Okay. Moving on to our next dictator. Okay. Oh, sorry. Benito Mussolini, who took control of Italy. Okay. So Benito Mussolini was elected prime minister in Italy in 1922. Okay. So also shortly after the Treaty of Versailles, and he almost immediately begins to start passing laws to make Italy into a one-party system. You should see a little bit of a common thread here, very similar to what Hitler does. Hitler says he actually got some inspiration from Mussolini and the way Mussolini took power. And then also by 1925, Benito Mussolini had transformed Italy into a complete dictatorship. All right. The end doesn't mean so well of World War II with Benito Mussolini. Just to give you guys a little bit of a spoiler alert, as Allied forces are pushing into Italy, in the spring of 1945, him and his wife, Benito Mussolini, they flee, try to escape Italy and go to another country, but they are captured by resistance fighters. They're executed on the spot by a firing squad, and they are hung outside of a store in Italy, just a random store, to basically degrade his corpse and show that this is what happens to people who try to become dictators. That's what the resistance fighters were trying to show. Obviously, though, he was very, very successful for almost a 20-year period in Italy in terms of consolidating his power and creating a dictatorship. But we'll talk more about Italy next time. So, moving a little bit away from Europe, very quickly, we're going to talk about Japan. Okay, so remember we said Japan is starting to grow into a little bit of an imperial power. They invaded China in the Manchuria region in 1933, in that northeastern part of China, for more resources and to be able to give their people more jobs. Hideki Tojo becomes the Japanese prime minister in early 1941, so a little bit later than the other leaders, but he's not really, even though he's the prime minister and the military leader, he's not really the person with the quote-unquote most power. That's actually the Japanese emperor who has the final say on things. But Hideki Tojo is the guy that I kind of like to focus on because he leads the military. Okay, so he's the military commander for Japan. But he would also follow any direct orders from the emperor as well. So even if the emperor didn't have the best ideas, Hideki Tojo would not be the one to contradict him. Okay. After the war, Hideki Tojo is tried for crimes against humanity. He is executed for committing crimes against humanity in 1945. And as we talk about World War II, we'll talk about what some of those things were. Okay. So that's, kind of on the Axis side, the three big ones there, Germany, Italy, and Japan. So now I'm moving more over to the Allied side. Okay. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of England from 1940 to 1945. Very, very, very famous person in England, very, very popular Prime Minister because he's the one who kind of got them through World War II. He's also one of my favorite politicians of all time. Winston Churchill's mother was actually an American. His father was an English lord who had an American wife. But Winston Churchill was born in the late 1800s, 1880s. And from an early age, he always had visions of greatness for himself. And he thought that he was always going to be able to do big things in British politics. And he always kind of had an eye on national leadership for himself. And this, a lot of older gentlemen, when he first started getting into politics in the early 1900s, thought that he was a little bit of abrasive and an upstart because he kind of had this chip on his shoulder. He thought he had an idea that he could really go out and make a difference in the world. So once he starts to get elected to Parliament, which is England's legislative branch, in the early 1920s, he starts kind of not necessarily gaining support and gaining followers, but gaining people who recognize that he had a good military mind. He had a good political strategy. He's willing to see what the people wanted, and he's kind of almost a man of the people, even though he came from an aristocratic background. Okay, in Parliament in England in the 1930s, he's took the lead in kind of calling out Hitler and being one of the main voices saying that England should build up its military because of a reaction of what Hitler's doing. He recognizes Hitler might try to invade other countries, might try to start another war. And so he wants England to be proactive against that. Obviously, that doesn't happen, spoiler, but Winston Churchill wants to kind of be on the alert. And so that's part of the reason why he gets elected prime minister in 1940 after the war has started, because he's kind of seen as the guy who saw it coming all along. And so if he can kind of see those things, then he'd be a good leader to lead us through the rest of the war. And then obviously, last but not least, we have this gentleman in charge of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As World War II comes about, he actually is entering into his third term. Okay, so he's elected in 1932 for his first term, 1936 for his second term, and then in 1940 he'll be elected to his third term. Okay, so as World War is breaking out in Europe, he's elected to his third term. Now, Franklin Roosevelt is a little bit of an unprecedented situation in U.S. history. He actually ends up winning 4 terms into office. In 1944, he wins a 4th term. But after FDR dies in 1945, less than 10 years later, the 22nd Amendment is passed in Congress, which limits the amount of presidential terms to just 2. Okay, so now only 2 terms, 2 4-year terms is the max that presidents are allowed to serve. Roosevelt is seen as kind of a unique scenario in American politics because of the Great Depression, because of World War II. People said that's kind of the only reason that he was able to win those votes, win those elections, and that even though it was a unique circumstance, that was too long for one person to be in power. All right. So talking about the lead up to the war, we talked about the leaders, we talked about some of the background stuff. But, now we're getting to 1938, 1939. How does war actually start? Okay. So in 1939, Germany under Adolf Hitler, they know that they're getting ready to attack other countries. They know that they're getting ready to declare war. So if you think about Germany on a map, okay, it kind of sits in the middle of Europe. Hitler knew that he did not want anyone attacking the eastern border of Germany while he was invading Western Europe. Okay, so he only wanted to fight on one front at a time. If you know anything about military tactics, you do not want to be fighting a 2-front war if you can help. You don't want to be fighting on your east side and your west side. You want to stick it just one at a time. So as Hitler is getting ready to invade Poland, which is the country between Germany and the Soviet Union, aka Russia, Hitler's preparing for this. He talks to the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, and they decide to sign a non-aggression pact. Okay? So this would basically say that they would not pick up arms against each other. They were not fighting each other. Okay? No matter what, even if Hitler and Germany start to attack other countries around the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would not take up arms against Germany. And then in return, Germany would also not attack or try to invade the Soviet Union. So Hitler thinks that, okay, I can take care of Poland real quick, and then I got my Eastern Front taken care of because the Soviet Union and Russia said they're not going to attack me, and so then I can just concentrate on one front. So that's why he does this. Okay, Hitler does go back on his word eventually, but we'll talk about what that looks like in a couple minutes. Okay. So the start of World War II, the official start. As we talk about, here's our maps right here. We got Germany, Poland, Soviet Union, aka Russia. Okay. So on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, takes over its government, captures the capital, okay? And then, because of the non-aggression pact that they made, the Soviet Union moves into the other part of Poland and also some of these Baltic nations of Latvia and Lithuania. So the Soviet Union kind of gains control of a couple other countries. Germany gets half of Poland, and Germany gets its eastern border secure, okay? This was a really, really, really big deal because now, like I said, Germany has taken over this land. They can secure up that one border. The UK, United Kingdom, England, and France had treaties signed with Poland that it would come to their aid, but it was way too slow. It wasn't fast enough. The German war machine was too quick for them. Okay, so they couldn't send out aid fast enough, despite all these warning signs that this attack was coming. They didn't respond quick enough. Okay, so Germany directly annexed Western Poland by October 8th, so a little bit less than a month later, and then the Soviets did the same with Eastern Poland. And Poland really, we talk a lot about Germany, England, and France, and the U.S. during World War II. What happened in Poland was actually, huge population devastating. Poland would go on to lose 6 million people during the war, which was almost 20%. Okay, 20% of its entire population. Of these 6 million people, 5.2 million, okay, would be civilian deaths. Okay, so only 800,000 troops would die from Poland. The majority, okay, over 80% of the deaths in Poland would be civilian deaths due to the Holocaust exterminations and other war crimes committed by the Germans and the Soviets. Okay, so in terms of overall numbers, Poland doesn't lose the most people, but in terms of civilians and percentages of its entire population, Poland by far lost the most people. Okay, so what happened in Poland is really, really devastating. So after Germany gets its eastern border secure with Poland, it has its treaty going on with the Soviet Union. Germany then turns and sets its sights on France, its historic enemy. Okay, so after Germany captures Poland, we said they had a treaty with France. Poland did. So France launches a very small offensive against Germany. But after only 1 month, that gets repelled back into it. Okay. And so then winter happens. Okay. Winter of 1939. And if you guys know anything about military tactics at the time, you basically did not want to be fighting in winter. It's hard to move around. It's cold. You can't be outside for long periods of time. So everybody kind of hunkers down for the winter. Okay. But in the spring of 1940, Germany would begin operations coming through the Netherlands and the Belgium, which were officially neutral territories at the time, to kind of sneak in France's back door. Okay. Now, this was a big no-no in international politics, and basically Germany was declaring war on the Netherlands and Belgium by doing this, but Germany didn't really care. Hitler said, we're just going to kind of use your country. We're taking over because we can, because we have that military might. So now Belgium and the Netherlands are Nazi-occupied territories, okay? And Luxembourg as well, which is a very, very small country in between the German and French border in one part, okay? Italy would also come in through southeastern France and invade in the summer of 1940. And so very, very quickly, Germany, with the help of Italy, takes over France, captures Paris, okay? However, German military might is looking good, but now it has a problem. how do we get to England? Okay. Obviously, you have the English Channel in the North Sea there. So how do you get to England? Hitler did not want to use the German Navy to attack England because he thought that the Royal Navy of England had the advantage at the time. Okay. So Hitler's got to figure out some way to try and attack England because he wanted this done bing, bang, boom. He wanted to try to conquer these countries really quickly. That way they wouldn't have time to mobilize their military, possibly gain support from the rest of the world, particularly the U.S. He really wanted to get this done quickly as possible and expand his empire and then sit on it. And then he could, the longer he controlled these areas, the less likely it was that people were going to challenge him on it. And he was going to rebuild that German empire. So Hitler decides that the best way to do it is to weaken England's resistance by air. Okay, so they're going to bomb them by air. So they're German, with the German Air Force, for lack of a better term, was called the Luftwaffe. And then the British Air Force was the RAF, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force. Sorry. This is one of the few battles, the Battle of Britain, as you see there, which occurred between July and October of 1940s. It was one of the few battles of the war fought entirely by air forces. Okay? So when it started out, the bombing was mainly done against airfields and factories on both sides, with the British bombing the German factories, the Germans bombing the British factories, because they were trying to slow down their war production. Okay? They were trying to slow down what they did, their ability to make guns, to make tanks, to make planes, all this kind of stuff. However, after England was carrying out some raids against industrial Berlin, it was a very cloudy night, okay, with stormy skies rolling in. They accidentally dropped some bombs on civilian areas. So after this, in retaliation, Hitler withdrew the directive for the Luftwaffe to only attack industrial targets, and he said, you are now okay to attack civilian areas. And so the bombing of London began. And the reason that this is significant because the London is not only the political capital of England, it's also the cultural capital of England. It's kind of New York City and Washington, D.C. combined, if you want to think of the U.S. So there's a very, very huge amount of historic churches here, cultural museums, very, very old artifacts. There's actually churches over 1,000 years old, or at least pieces of them that are 1,000 years old, that were ended up being bombed and damaged by this. And so Hitler was really trying to break British morale. He wanted to, kind of destroy their culture, attack citizens. And so a lot of times they would have these air raids that would go on as they were being bombed, and they would have to go down into, the civilians would go down into the subway tunnels at nighttime or whenever the bombs came to try and protect themselves from the bombs. Now, as I said, London is not only the cultural capital, it's also the political capital. So the Parliament building is here, and the British version of the White House, which is number 10 Downing Street, is where the Prime Minister stays, where Winston Churchill stayed. And Churchill's kind of a badass and also kind of a crazy person for doing this. But as these bombs would come into London, he would go up onto the roof of 10 Downing Street, and he would watch as the Germans bombed London to get a kind of an idea about the military sense, to really soak it in and see the devastation. He wanted to see that for himself because he thought that would be able to lead him to better decisions about the wars if he was able to see the destruction firsthand. Okay? However, despite Hitler's best intentions, Germany fails to beat RAF in a quick battle. It becomes withdrawn. Okay? So this postpones a sea invasion of England. It's the first major setback of World War II for the Germans, and Hitler is now kind of stuck in a quagmire, in a swamp on the Western Front, something that he wanted to wrap up really quickly. So he's kind of stalled out on the Western Front. And that's very, very frustrating for Hitler for some reasons that we are going to see shortly. Okay? But before we get into what Hitler does next, I want to talk a little bit about the United States. For the United States, as all this stuff is going on in Europe, war is starting to break out to War starting to break out in Europe. Dictators are coming into power, fascist dictator. We talked about Italy with Benito Mussolini. We talked about Adolf Hitler in Germany. And so the U.S. sees what's going on, and they kind of realize this is going on. But because of the U.S. public response after the end of World War I, the U.S. wants to be an isolationist. It refused to join the League of Nations. Congress did not approve the Treaty of Versailles, so it wants to stay isolated, especially because of the problems of the Great Depression. The American public did not want to get involved into another European affair. And one of the ways it did this was the Neutrality Acts, and this was a gradual passage of laws which outlawed businesses to sell arms, trucks, and by arms we mean guns, not literal arms, to sell weapons, trucks, or any war-making materials to countries already involved in war. And 4 of these laws were passed between 1935 and 1939. Okay, so this was a series of measures trying to keep the U.S. from becoming involved in a war. All right. However, the president at the time, FDR, realized that the U.S. was probably going to get drawn into this sooner or later. So even though he realized that the American public did not necessarily want to join the war, he knew that the U.S. was likely to join it anyways, and so he wanted to try and gradually get them into it. And the first thing he did was the Lend-Lease Act. Okay, so this basically repealed a lot of the previous neutrality acts. It officially ended U.S. isolationism, and it allowed U.S. to sell food, oil, bullets, ships, and planes to Britain and France, who are fighting Germany, and also to China, who is fighting Japan. Okay, and even though I say sell, they didn't officially sell it because of the wording that was used there. Okay, Lend-Lease. They would lend Germany, they would lend not Germany. I'm sorry. They would lend England and France and China these materials, and then in return, these countries would allow the U.S. to use their military bases. Okay, so this aid was legit free. Okay, $28 billion in aid between 1939 and 1944. Okay, and you can see by my graphic there what exactly all that aid was spent on. A lot of it was arms, but also a lot of food and other industrial material. Okay, and the way that Franklin Roosevelt kind of sold this to the American public was that, if you see someone in need, that you don't mind helping them out a little bit if you know it's going to cost you a lot later on. So he said we should get in front of this. We'll help them out a little bit now. This is going to save us money in the long run. Okay? So that's how the U.S. starts to get kind of slowly into the war. However, as the U.S. was getting slowly in the war, I did mention that some of this aid was going to China. That was because of Japan's imperial tendencies and imperial ambitions in the Pacific Ocean. Okay. So in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, which is this region right up here where I'm wiggling my mouse around, and they start to expand. And even though Japan's this tiny little island nation right here, they have a very, very high industrial power. They have a lot of industrial might. And so they start pushing in there. And China was very, very much an agricultural majority nation. For lack of a better term, it could be seen as what we would know as a third world country. Okay, not a lot of cities. Majority was farmland. Not a lot of advanced military technology. So it's very easy for Japan to go in and take over that. All right. However, as Japan starts to expand outward into the Pacific Ocean and starts getting these other countries under their thumb, this is going to cause some alarm in the U.S. because if you remember, U.S. is right over here. We got the Pacific Ocean between them. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. picks up the territories of Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, which, Hawaii, Guam, Philippines are right in here. Okay, obviously this map's not really to scale. And so the U.S. realized that Japan might be slowly thinking about making its way towards the United States. And really, besides a couple small island nations, the Pacific Ocean is the only thing separating the United States and Japan. And so, but because of the Great Depression, because of these economic problems that the U.S. is facing in the 1930s, because of it wanting to be isolationist, U.S. doesn't really respond much to Japan invading another country. Okay, and even though this was a violation of international relationships, violating international treaties, the only thing that the U.S. does to kind of basically give a finger wagging to Japan is that it decides to place an embargo on oil exports to Japan, which basically means that the United States said they're not going to sell any oil to Japan anymore. All right. The reason that this is such a big deal is because the U.S. was one of the major oil exporters in the world at the time. Also, for any kind of Japanese military machines, planes, tanks, trucks, automobiles, anything like that, you needed oil to do. Okay, so basically, the U.S. is trying to put economic sanctions on Japan in order to do it. So the U.S. kind of, Japan invades. U.S. places some economic sanctions. It's kind of a small finger wagging, and this kind of just makes Japan even madder, kind of poking the bear, so to say. And so they decide to make a preemptive strike against the United States. Okay, so with no declaration of war, no warning at all, on December 7th, 1941, what FDR said was a day that would live in infamy in the United States history. Japan attacks the U.S. at the Pearl Harbor Navy base in Hawaii. Okay, Japanese did it as a measure to keep the U.S. from interfering with their plans in Southeast Asia, despite the fact that there was ongoing peace talks between the two countries happening at the time. Okay, so despite the fact that there was Japanese diplomats in the U.S. trying to have peace talks going on, Japan still sneaks attack to the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. Okay, very, very terrible time in U.S. history. As you can see, 2,400 U.S. casualties, a little over 1,000 wounded, and only 65 Japanese casualties. So way more U.S. casualties than Japanese. And up until 9/11, September 11, 2001, it is the deadliest attack by a foreign power on American soil. Okay, so huge, huge, huge losses here. Within 24 hours, so by the time of December 8th, FDR, the president, he goes to Congress, asks them to declare war on Japan. The president does not have the power to declare war. That power is on Congress, but the president can ask Congress to declare war because he's kind of that figurehead. He's a person officially in charge of the military as a commander-in-chief. And so he asked Congress to declare war. Looking back, some revisionist historians have said that FDR knew of the attack and let it happen. Most historians agree that this is highly unlikely, that FDR actually knew of the attack, that he would have let it happen. There might have been some small inkling of it, that it might have happened, but most historians agree that FDR did not know that this was definitely coming, that it was not known for sure that it was coming, and he did not let it happen by any means. So now we have, with the U.S. entering into World War II, we have the official setup. The Allies on one side, the Axis powers on the other. So the United States, Great Britain, Canada, technically France is in the Allies, but the majority of France is taken over by the Nazis at this point. So I left them off my list, against the Axis powers of Italy, Germany, and Japan. Now, the Soviet Union does join the Allies, but only after being invaded by Germany. If you remember, in 1939, Hitler and the Soviet Union, Hitler and Stalin, they signed a non-aggression pact. However, in June 22nd of 1941, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, which is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, so we talked about Hitler kind of stalling out on the Western Front, not being able to conquer England. He wanted to be able to do that first before he attacked the Soviet Union, so he didn't have to fight on the two sides of Western and the Eastern Front. That doesn't happen. England's able to fend him off with the Royal Air Force, but he decides to go ahead with Operation Barbarossa and basically stab the Soviet Union in the back. Okay, so the Eastern Front fighting between the Germans and the Soviet Union would see the deadliest and heaviest fighting in the entire World War II. More people died fighting on the Eastern Front than every other battle in World War II combined. So huge, huge losses. Okay. The Soviet Union lost during the war the most amount of people total of any country. Okay. They lost around 20 million of 20 million people total, about 8 to 11 million military personnel, and 8 to 9 million civilians due to disease and famine and the Holocaust combined. Of the 5 million Soviet troops that the Axis captured, that Germany captured, the Nazis deliberately starved or killed 3.3 million of them. So we're talking about, committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, all that terrible stuff. And then the Nazis murdered over 1 million Soviet Jews in the Holocaust. Okay, so we talked about Poland a little bit in terms of the overall population losing the most, but in terms of just total numbers, the Soviet Union by far lost the most amount of people in World War II and the most amount of civilians, whether it was due to crimes against humanity committed by the Nazis or disease or famine. So very, very terrible stuff happening in World War II, which is part of the reason why it's so important to learn about. Okay. So this is the end of the notes for today. That's where we're going to leave off for now. So hopefully you guys learned a lot. It's very, very interesting stuff. Mr. Lee would love to talk more about this, but we only have so much time, or that I can keep you guys in class. I try to keep it somewhat brief. So you guys are going to have a quiz that you need to do in Schoology. So go ahead and take that, and then that is it for today. Okay. Hope you guys enjoy your day and have a wonderful rest of it. And I will not see you tomorrow, but you guys will be able to hear my voice again tomorrow. Bye-bye.